Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chitty chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. With us today is Richard Gilliver from the Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we are going to be talking about prepping. Okay, so grab your English tea or your fat-free vanilla latte with no foam and join us as we discuss preparations for the end of the world as we know it. While all that catchy intro music is playing, please take a moment to like this episode and subscribe so that you can catch all of our shows. You can also hit that reminder button on whatever platform you're using so that you'll be notified as soon as each episode is released. This is episode 32, Prepping. Okay, gentlemen, what are we prepping for?
I
don't know because I've not prepped.
In general, I think. I was late to this recording session because I hadn't made my cup of English tea before the episode started, and our agreed recording time had elapsed. So I'm very ill prepared in lots of ways.
And I have a feeling you probably have enough English tea for say like 2 or 3 weeks or so, maybe like a box.
Oh,
right?
oh no, I've got a good couple of months worth in there. Yeah, no, I can keep going for a
Well,
while.
then you can handle anything, dude.
Just the bags. I've no month supply of milk, so I don't know what I'm going to do there. But
oh yeah, you can't have tea without milk, so that could be an issue. Yeah. Okay, so when I think of prepping for me, I probably have like maybe a month or two worth of food, like two if we eat like very, very light. But I just buy like a few extra cans here and there and a few extra boxes here and there just to have on hand, right? So when we say prepping, that's not really what we're talking about though, is it? Like what do you guys think of when you hear the word prepping?
I think of like kind of preppers, like the classic kind of American.
American.
American up in the hills with the kind of the long range rifles and and handguns and the underground bunkers and
yeah, I was about to say their house is all like with the vegetation on top of it and underground. So that's kind of so you guys don't have those over in Britain?
Sure we do.
Room for them over here. We can't just drive out and build a bunker in the middle of nowhere.
That's true, huh? You guys have limited space.
Highly densely populated.
Yeah.
And no guns.
I don't know. I bet you guys have a few. You have like 3 people out in the country who have like their medieval English castles chocked full of all kinds of like boxed foods and canned goods and
no, because they just get weekly grocery deliveries from like Ocado or something, and it's like, or Waitrose, like they're not stocked up ready for an apocalypse. They're just like ready for the week ahead. No, I think it's interesting thing about prepping because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of like motivation for undertaking like long-term preparedness in your household, like a lot of people do it because they're worried about like the political stability of the country. And a lot of people do it for religious apocalyptic reasons as well. And obviously the ways that people go about it, I guess, is similar in both of those instances in terms of you've got to be ready not only to feed your family and yourself, but you've also got to be able to survive against other humans in a crazy end of the world scenario. So there's quite a lot of different sort of aspects to it, really, aren't there?
Oh, that's true. Yeah, because I thought of prepping when I read the episode title as really just being like stocking up on a lot of food and being prepared for I don't know, not being able to grab groceries, right? But you're right. When you think of hardcore prepping or like the preppers, as Gilliver was saying, you there's like this whole range of behaviors that go with it, which includes like guns and ammo and
like upskilling in loads of things, like being able to cure meat or being able to pickle things, it's being able to skin animals, being able to do things with wood and fire, and it's like practical skills which would in a world without electricity would become useful, or without an internet connection will be useful.
See, they're the things that you would imagine are going to be useful under those kinds of circumstances. But when you kind of see the popular depictions of prepping, which is what I always have the kind of mental image of, it's always just a shitload of guns and ammunition and tinned food.
And a whole plate worth of conspiracy theories, right? Yeah. Like that's sort of the more what do you call it? Stereotypical prepper. Like they're full of conspiracy theories, and they're full of this is what's going to happen, and I'm sure of it. Yeah, I think I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb and be really generous here. I think that's the minority of preppers. I think very few preppers, because I know a few who stock up years worth of food. One of whom is one of those conspiracy theories, sort of crazy nut. That was me putting a judgment call on them. But people who their reasoning doesn't quite sound justified. But then I also know people who are just like, yeah, what if our economy crashes? Or, what if COVID gets really, really bad and our infrastructure breaks down, right? And I know in the beginning of COVID, that was especially important to people.
I saw, I think it was a couple of weeks now ago, a video on YouTube from quite a few years ago of this lady who had been prepping in case of a pandemic. And the video starts with, it was on like some American cable channel. And the video starts with them explaining a pandemic is when a virus gets out of control in multiple countries around the world. And it was really funny because I imagine at the time it seemed like a really weird thing to prepare for. Like, why on earth are you preparing for a global outbreak of disease where everybody will have to isolate at home or whatever? Because of course that's not going to happen. Because I remember thinking at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that would never, like this happening never occurred to me. Never once did I think, oh gosh, we might all end up locked down in our houses to, fight off a global infectious disease. But then you look to what she did, and it was, overboard with hindsight of what the pandemic looked like and what, lockdowns were and things. But I remember predicting at the beginning of the pandemic when we were locked down, the Prime Minister came on TV and told us all to stay in our homes and stuff. I was like, there's going to be looting in the shops and there's going to be riots on the streets because people are, and obviously there have been protests and stuff. But in terms of prepping, that's looking back and thinking, she was ready for something that I didn't believe would happen. What other possibilities of things that might happen do I currently think are ridiculous to think about, that actually might just happen unexpectedly and catch me unawares? And I guess that's the mindset, isn't it, of the people who are prepared for those situations, because they're like, well, yeah, nobody thinks it's going to happen and it will happen and I'm ready for it.
Do you not think, though, that there has been no need for anyone to stock up, or apart from like extreme circumstances during the pandemic? It's not really made a difference whether I don't know of anybody who's died because they've not stocked up on food.
No, but I think
know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. But I think it's really easy now to think, actually, if this aspect or this aspect or this aspect were different at the beginning of the pandemic, maybe actually everything could have gone to shit in a much bigger way. And I'm not talking about in terms of like, cases and deaths and things, but in terms of like food supply chain and all those sorts of things, like it would have been really easy for those to just have completely broken down much worse than they did for most people. And it's not like there weren't, shortages of some things, and, like supermarkets limited the number of items people could buy and what have you. But I can really easily foresee, that having gone a very different way, and not thinking like conspiratorial or anything, just, these systems are really complex and it takes actually very little for them to break down. Obviously, currently in the news, as we're recording in the UK, there's been people panic buying petrol and diesel at petrol stations because there's a shortage of drivers to take the fuel to the petrol stations. And so people are panicking about that. Like, that's one specific part of that whole supply chain that has resulted in that whole thing just being crazy, and there's people, restricting how much petrol people can buy at petrol stations. And I don't know, you can, like I say, you can imagine that on the scale of everything. Actually, it could have all just gone wrong. It didn't, and I'm really thankful for that. I don't know who to. I say thankful, but it's like I'm not.
You're grateful, thankful, yeah.
Yeah, it's like I'm really grateful that, and glad that didn't happen, but it could have easily gone that way.
Well, and I think to some degrees it did. Like there were food deserts that were made worse. There were supply chains that were entirely broken. There were parts of grocery store shelves that were completely barren for certain periods of time. And some of that was sort of the oh, now I have to prep, so people are like jumping to buy as fast as possible when they could have been buying over the previous years or months. So some of it was a little bit of like panic buying, but some of it was broken supply chains, as you said. And I don't know.
A lot of that, like even recently with like the shortage of drivers of things in the UK, to get supply shops. Like I went to the Co-op just down the road, like the shop down the road, last week, and I think like basically all of the freezers, they must have had like 1/10 of what they normally stock in the freezers. And not that I was going there to buy anything from the freezers, but it was just like, if I was coming to buy something that isn't on the shelves, I do have the option of buying other things. It's not like an end of the world. They don't have anything for me to eat there. Like supply chains did break down and certain things were limited, but not in a way that actually affected a lot of people's lives. Obviously it did to some people, but
it at least made things very inconvenient. But you're right.
Yeah, it's an inconvenience rather than an emergency situation.
Right. But then there's also, so the other side of it that I can think of specifically with this pandemic is the job loss, right? Like, so, and we have a lot of social services and people have, neighbors or community services that can help them out. I know that we have local food banks and food kitchens that will give food out, that do give food out for free, to people in need. But at the same time, that's not always readily available to everyone. So I could see like another area where prepping is appropriate. Like if you have a really stable job, like a really successful one, say as like an engineer or something like that, and your firm just happens to be one of the ones that are closing during the pandemic, and because of everything going on, finding a new job right away isn't like viable. Or even someone in like the services who doesn't make a lot of money, right? And maybe doesn't have a savings account. Now suddenly having that food saved up could be really, really valuable, right? So I think that there's a legitimate need for some saving and preparing. Now, whether or not it needs to be 2 to 3 years worth of food, whether or not you need the bunker and the 50 guns and like 800 cases of ammo, whether you need to be pickling your own eggs, like maybe there's a point where it's a little bit superfluous, or like it's one of those
eggs is always superfluous.
always.
Completely necessary.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that those people who were impacted by losing their jobs and who did struggle and were really having a hard time finding their next meal, they might not be the ones who can do a lot of prepping, but just buying a couple extra cans or boxes at 68 cents a can or $1 a box, like each shopping trip could have resulted in weeks worth of food saved up, So I think that there is a valid argument for some, like I'm talking within the terms of this specific this specific pandemic. Yeah, things didn't fall to shit quite as much as they could have.
And I'm certainly not trying to, in what I said before, certainly not trying to like minimize the effects that the pandemic has had on people, because obviously it has been dramatic and horrendous in so many cases. But like society didn't collapse.
Right.
And I think lots of people can easily see how it could have.
Right. And I think to your point, like if anything, that just shows that either A, our social services are working because people got through it even though they didn't have jobs, or B, if they didn't get through it, we need to increase those social services, because what you're saying is true. Like something really, really bad happened. We've had, terrible floods. We had what happened in New Orleans when the levees broke. That was absolutely devastating. And people were, prepping or not, like if you lose your house, your prepped food goes with it, right? Like that bunker just got swept away. So I think that to your point, when we have these disasters, that society doesn't collapse and the nations don't collapse, but we have these things that interrupt our ability to get to basic goods and services. That's where I think social services being really like polished and emphasized is a valid point.
Yeah, and you've just touched on rather seriously on a point I was thinking of in a more comedic kind of fashion, and that's just because you're prepped, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I was thinking about kind of, if there was like an asteroid strike and it hits your house, it doesn't matter how much you've prepped, you won't do anything. You're just disintegrated there and then.
Yeah.
And, you can prep as much as you want, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to survive anything.
So that brings up sort of a good point, is typically when you talk to the really extreme preppers, they're talking about one specific scenario that they think is going to happen. Or maybe two or three. Like sometimes it's just a general end of the world scenario, and they're like, well, it could be the economy, it could be like a takeover from another nation or a collapse. And they're a little bit more flexible. Sometimes they're really rigid. And this is what is going to happen, and I'm sure of it. But what you don't see is like what you were saying, is that sort of recognition that no matter how much we prepare, no matter how much food we have stashed away, there's some scenario out there somewhere that's a reasonable scenario that could make all of that prep work completely like worthless.
Yeah. And I think the examples you gave in terms of natural disasters are, there are some natural disasters that you can, to some degree predict and expect. If you live in an area that's below sea level and you're next to a river, flooding is going to happen, and you can prepare very specifically to meet the sort of situation that you're in, can't you? You prepare things in order to waterproof your house, in order to make sure you've got essentials upstairs and not downstairs, or whatever it is.
Right.
But yeah, there are those unknown unknowns, aren't there, that you just cannot prepare for in any given situation. Like the specifics of the COVID pandemic, would have been difficult to predict in terms of the specific things that would go wrong, that would need to prepare for. Is it food? Is it weapons to defend? People were not in the streets fighting for food supplies, but if they were, a gun would be useful to some people, in some people's eyes, because it means your family are going to get fed that day instead of someone else's family. It also matters, it does make you think, how people prepare is also important. Like stocking up food is one thing, but preparing to fight the other humans to survive is certainly, in my mind, a completely other thing, like a completely separate idea.
Oh yeah.
I can
or preparing to fight the elements, right? Like you have people who will stockpile things like sleeping bags and firewood and stuff like that. Yeah, so definitely multiple.
And trust me, having spent many months up in the mountains in Scotland, the elements are much more of a threat than people are.
Yeah. No, I live right up against the mountains, and it's the same thing. I went to high school up in the mountains, and I remember, or I went to all my schooling was up in the mountains, and I remember doing wilderness survival training in my elementary school and in my middle school. And we went out and learned how to build shelters out of snow or build shelters out of tree limbs. And we learned how to start a fire without matches and just different stuff like that. Because it is still a big deal. Like we think we've mastered nature, but all we've really done is built structures to kind of keep it outside and keep us
hidden from it. We've not mastered it. We've hidden away from it.
We've just learned how to duck and cover. Like we're just a hair's breadth away from not being able to survive at all, because we've lost a lot of those skills. So some of those preppers, like I have a lot of respect for them, because they really do have skills that are sort of a lost art.
And that's the thing. It's like how much of our lives depends on a permanent electricity supply. Like, could I just suddenly cook in my house now if I didn't have an electricity supply? No, because everything I use to cook with runs off electricity. I might be able to find the camping stove that we've got in the cupboard for when we go camping that runs off a little gas bottle.
Right.
But I've only got one of those. Do you know what I mean? Like, just having no electricity means suddenly I can't communicate with anybody. I can't cook. I can't heat my home. Obviously, we've got some sort of insulation and blankets and whatever. Yeah. But, just something as simple as the electricity going, suddenly we lose a lot of our abilities to do things because we depend on those things. And we're not skilled enough in order to replace the things that will be lost with a lack of electricity, for example.
Yeah, we've gotten really, really comfortable, and chances are relatively good that we can continue to be comfortable and not need any of those skills and grow old and die, and we'll be just fine, right? And so I don't really blame the person who doesn't have any survival skills whatsoever, or the person that really relies on their creature comforts. to a degree, it's like to each his own, right? Like I don't judge their lack of preparedness. I'm doing that in air quotes. But at the same time, those who do prepare and those who do have those skills, I also don't negatively judge them. If anything, I think it's kind of cool and handy to have, you know. Even if it's just I remember reading a story, God, years back about people in their car who got trapped in their car for like 3 or 4 days in a snowstorm, and they survived by just like burning a candle. Like they had emergency kits in their car, and they were able to burn a candle on and off every few, I don't know, minutes or whatever, in order to keep the temperature in the car up. And and I can't remember how I think they eventually resorted to using one of the tires. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they had the skills and the knowledge to survive in a car in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm until someone discovered them and was able to rescue them, because they had that little bit of training or common sense knowledge. And you might say like that's never going to happen to me, but that specific scenario is probably a lot more realistic than like an end of the world apocalypse scenario.
And it did happen to them.
It's
not hypothetical. Yeah, it did happen.
I was thinking about what if there was only one thing, just one thing or one item that you've got, one skill set or one item that would, in let's say a major kind of apocalyptic kind of scenario, and you had to survive, what one thing to hand or one skill set to hand do you think would be the most helpful for you that you have in your home?
The fact that I can play the church organ, I think it's a vital skill.
Definitely. Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly going to move me up the hierarchy of the humans that remain.
They'll just feed you because you're providing a social service that is invaluable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just stalling for time while I think of an actual answer. So Laura, you can go first.
So it really depends on the scenario, because I think it would differ from scenario to scenario. Because off the top of my head, I think, like, for example, if I could take one thing into the wilderness with me, like if I happen to get stranded in the wilderness and have one thing, what would it be? I would say a hatchet, right? Because it can be used towards multiple ends, but most especially building a shelter and creating a source of heat. And then you can improvise with it for the rest of the stuff. But that's only one thing, and really to survive, like whoever only needs exactly one thing to survive, right? Our survival depends on so many different facets. So I almost think the question itself is a little bit problematic, because it would almost be like what set of things or what types of things would be necessary for survival. Like access to clean water, right? Which we totally take for granted. But then also there's different scenarios. So you go to Gil's scenario of, let's say the infrastructure collapses and there's no power in your house. Well, that hatchet may or may not be quite as useful, but something like a generator, right, to produce heat or to be able to cook your food, might be more valuable. So yeah, it's a really hard question to answer without knowing like a very, very specific scenario.
It's purposefully hard because you don't know what's, as Richard said earlier, you don't know what scenario's coming along.
Right.
And I think you could argue, you know, like we're very reliant on food just being in supermarkets, but actually if I suddenly was here without a supply of food, how would I get food? Well, I know there are some sheep and cows in a couple, you know, in some fields further down, and I know it's blackberry season at the moment, so I could get some blackberries. But, you know, like past that, where would I even go? What would I look for? What would I, you know, that sort of foraging or hunting or things like that, yeah, certainly I wouldn't even know where to start. And even if I did, like, I don't really know what I'm doing with a dead sheep to, you know, feed my family. I can have a go and I'll surely learn as I go along. But
yeah, you'll do a hack job of it, but you'll make it happen.
Yeah.
That's a good point, because Gilliver did say item or skill. And I think if there's any one skill that would be relatively useful, no matter the scenario, it would be some sort of knowledge or familiarity with plants. Like gardening would be great if you're talking about being in a suburban area with your yard and everything and needing to grow your own food. But then also just identifying edible plants if you're out in the wilderness. So it kind of covers any sort of other than, you know, like the plane crashes in the middle of the ocean and you're floating in the water scenario. It kind of covers
plants is limited use.
Right. I did hear about a guy who ate fish and like the eyeballs were how he got fresh water. I don't know. But yeah, having that knowledge of
I
being
agree
able
with
to
your face, Jillifer.
I mean, what if you're gonna survive, you gotta do
Yeah.
what you gotta do. I bet they become really delicious when your survival depends on it. But no, I mean, if we're just talking about one skill that would cover sort of the most amount of scenarios that I can think of off the top of my head, it would be an intimate knowledge with plants, either the ability to grow them and or identify them or both. Um, because even if you didn't have access to meat, you could at least keep yourself fed.
That's interesting because I was thinking more along the lines of you're at home and like a disaster happens.
Yeah.
But you've raised a really interesting point that and I was thinking more along the lines of what I had in the house, which would benefit that. But you raised an interesting point that that's more item based. Whereas if you're in a plane crash or something, it would necessarily be skill set based rather than item based.
And perhaps skill set might be more important, in a multitude of scenarios as opposed to items, which might be very scenario specific.
And items can also come and go. They can get lost or they can get broken, or the specific one you need just doesn't happen to be on that list of items you have available to you. So yeah, items can be very tricky, or not that they're not useful, but when you have the
your
skills,
house gets destroyed in the tornado and suddenly the items have gone. It's the same.
Yeah. Whereas a skill, you can adapt to your environment to get the items you need or to jerry rig the items you need, as long as you have enough familiarity with that skill.
Because I think that the prepping thing is interesting as well, because we kind of live in, in the UK, I'm just thinking about my life. I live in a society where if I lose my job, I'll get benefits from the government, and that we've got a healthcare that doesn't rely on me being able to pay for it. And we've got supermarkets close by which have very reasonably priced food. And I have a steady income, and I rely on all these things, and we live in a society that has all of those safety blankets around us. And I think it's dead easy to, and this is the world I live, the life I live, it's easy to have all of that around you and not prepare at all. Because as this conversation's gone on, I'm thinking, what do I have in my house that would be able to keep my family alive for however many weeks? And the answer is a very limited amount.
Right.
Because we rely on these systems that we've built up. And people talk about, oh, well, if you've got money saved up, then that's really good because you're there ready for any situation. But you think about hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s that suddenly rendered every bit of money that you had completely useless and null and void.
Yep. Yeah, money is utterly useless in the collapse of an economic system, right? You need to have those hard, what do they call them? When you're talking about like assets that are actual like items, like your house and I can't remember what they're called. But as opposed to money, which is just
money,
fiat,
which is imaginary and made up.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's really super interesting. Like, so we moved onto a bigger property like a year and a half ago, and we've been remodeling and stuff like that. And we've thrown around the idea of, and I've always had like a small amount of vegetables or fruits or like a fruit tree in every house that I've lived in. We've grown something, right? Even if it wasn't like substantial enough to actually sustain us. But it's something that we've always dabbled in. And we were talking about the idea of like homesteading to a point of like maybe having some sort of stuff that we're providing to ourselves. Not so much in the doomsday apocalypse into the world sense, but just like, yeah, having that sort of, I grew it myself, it's available to me, I don't have to rely on somebody else for it, just in case, right? Or just because it's nice to have fresh vegetables. But
self-reliance is a good thing. Like generally, it's just nice.
Yeah, and
be able to.
My brother does that. Like they have a huge amount, and we get a lot of free vegetables from them because they grow so many. If it doesn't go to their family members, then it goes to waste, right? So they end up giving away just massive amounts of vegetables. And my grandparents do it too. And my brother has chickens. And one thing that we have always talked about in our spoiled little household that is my household is how hard it would be, what a pain in the ass it would be to have chickens, to keep them clean and to replenish them as they die off or whatever. But I'll tell you, like, not only do they have a fresh source of protein and a fresh source of vegetables and fruits like available to them if something were to happen. And it might not be something that would last indefinitely. It might be a small enough amount that it would eventually get used up. But it would sustain them far longer than my backyard, which is just grass and trees, you know? So it's an interesting conversation, like the balance between inconvenience and work, but then having those things available to you.
And balancing that with the likelihood of any of these situations happening as well.
Oh, right.
But again, we've talked about how that's almost impossible to predict because, 2 years ago, we've never imagined a pandemic would happen. So, yeah. And obviously to prep to that extent where you are ready for as many scenarios as you can think of takes so much time, effort, energy, and you've to prioritize that over living your life in a way. And where do you draw that line? How do you meet that balance?
Yeah, I guess that the balance also involves, like, what is it doing for you in the now? Like, so in their case and in our case, when we were talking about it, it was more for the enjoyment of fresh eggs and fresh vegetables in the now. But, because it really, the amount that they're producing isn't sustainable over a long period of time. It's not a farm, and it has to be renewed by seeds that you buy at the store, right? Each year. So you have to like almost balance that, not only between like what is the likelihood of it happening versus not happening, but also between, hey, what sort of benefits or joy or pleasure is it giving me in the now, right? Because I know for them, for example, it's something that they really enjoy doing and they get really excited about it. Especially when you get a zucchini that's like this big and they're like, hey, who wants this zucchini, right? Like it's sort of it brings a sort of satisfaction in the moment that even if
is zucchini an aubergine, Gilliver? Is that what she's talking about?
I don't know.
Is it an aubergine or is it a courgette?
I think so.
It's a courgette or an aubergine. I can't remember.
It's a long green vegetable, and it's
courgette.
Usually,
there we go.
Okay.
Aren't aubergines eggplants in America?
Oh, there we go.
Those are the purple bulbous ones.
Oh yeah, because that's why they call them eggplants, because they look so much like eggs. Those long, big, bulbous purple things.
They don't look anything. Yeah.
Don't they look like eggs when they're like really little baby aubergines?
Maybe.
Isn't that why they call them eggplants? Because they like really look like little round eggs when they're tiny and babies.
I'm gonna have to look that up later. I don't know. Or hey, if you're listening to this, get on our Facebook page and let me know.
I was just gonna say, I know we're coming up to our commercial break any moment, but I wanted to talk about sort of religious ideas about prepping and Armageddon and things once we get back, if that's okay with you too.
Yeah, let's take off to commercials and then let's do it.
Right, so I know myself and Laura have just been on a fantastic show, which is International Free Thinkers, or IFWAS. It's brilliant, and we did a subject that we've done on our show before, which was parenting.
Yeah,
and it was a great panel on there. It was.
I'm not caught yet. I'm excited to.
Yeah, my only regret is we got kind of caught up in ourselves, right? We talked a lot about parenting and activism versus parenting, like secular parenting. So I almost want to do a redo on that. Like, not that the information was bad. It was a good conversation. But I really think there were a lot of topics that we could have and that I was hoping we would get into. So I want to do a double take on that one.
Yeah, I think it was quite a large panel. Mm-hmm. And when you've got a big panel and everybody's wants to and kind of have the say, you sometimes don't have a chance to. I mean, we know ourselves, just having three of us, how hard it is to.
How many rabbit holes we go down. Yeah, speaking of rabbit holes, this is the commercial break. So, Gilliver, what have you got coming up?
I can't remember what date we're on. I'm doing the non-profits on. I don't remember what day it is. I'm not sure if it's this
date of recording is 27, so this is coming out on the 29th.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be not this week, I think the week after, where I'll be on the non-profits. I could be wrong on that.
Nice.
Can't remember the date.
I will be on this week. So you're not on this week because you're not on
I'm not on this week.
You're not on my list, yeah. but
I'm not on with Laura.
maybe next week. Yeah.
She smells.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. I mean, you're not wrong.
It's why we both live so far away, Laura.
Right? There's a reason why I'm all the way over in America. They wouldn't have me any other way.
Throw her in the middle of the desert and all will be well.
Okay, so I will be on Nonprofits on the 3rd. So check me out there. And I think I have a couple of dates coming up in October as well. Let me check here. It will be airing on the 17th and the 24th. I will also be on the Nonprofits. So yeah. And then Gilliver, you should be on what, the 10th?
I don't know.
Okay, well, sometime in October.
I might be on the 3rd.
Like I said previously, like just catch all the Nonprofits.
Yeah.
And then you won't have to worry about whether or not it's one that we're on or not.
Catch the Nonprofits, catch the International Freethinkers, because that's a brilliant channel and it's not very well known, I don't think. So go and watch them, because I mean, I've been a fan of it for ages. I got so excited when I was asked to be on it. Like literally, it's one of the only atheist shows I watch. So nice. it was nice when I was asked on it. I just got a bit giddy.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm hoping to do more with them. It's kind of cool to get exposed. There's so many different secular, humanist, atheist, free thinker type communities out there, and I've only been exposed to just a small amount. So every time I'm exposed to a new one, I get really excited.
What's good as well about our Facebook discussion group is that if you can't be bothered to if you can't be bothered to type in the names of any of the shows that either of my two co-hosts have mentioned, Gilliver Norma just chucks a link on there, so you can find that and our show on all of our different platforms at a Linktree link, which is linktree/Skeptic Hangout, and that's in the description wherever you're viewing or listening to the show.
I have a challenge for our audience. So if you guys have a community or a Facebook page, a YouTube channel that you guys think are just really great with skeptical or humanist or freethinker ideas, get them out there, like put them up on our Facebook page and let's talk about them.
I think it'd be really easy to see like other channels as like competition to ours, but we like just the multitude of voices. I think is just really powerful, and like we're all sort of, you know, similar in what we're wanting in terms of like normalizing atheism and skepticism and promoting, you know, the values that we all believe in and stuff. So the more voices, the better, I say.
Yes, getting all those conversations out there. Yeah, I don't see it as competition at all. I see it as collaboration. And as
I do kind of see it as competition, but let's imagine it.
But you're willing to be magnanimous and allow a little bit of it in. All right, let's head back from commercial break. So, Gil, before commercial break, you had said that you wanted to discuss the more religious aspect of prepping. So I'm going to let you introduce that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked earlier on about how, you know, some of the motivations behind people prepping are things like, you know, pandemics or societal collapse and what have you. But obviously there are people who are predicting the actual like biblical apocalypse, for example, and my knowledge is mostly Christian based, so I don't know much about apocalyptic ideas in other religions. But certainly Christianity has a very vocal minority of people who are expecting the end times imminently. Obviously, having not seen the fact that people have been expecting the end times imminently for the past about 3,000 years.
Give or take when it was first brought up, yeah.
Give or take. And obviously there are specific like biblical descriptions, for example, of what the end times will look like. So I guess people have, in some ways, a better, I don't know, scenario sort of plotted out in front of them that they have to prep for and what have you. But I don't see it as like a mainstream Christian idea, though. You know, I don't go to my local church and they're all preaching about the end of the world. It seems to be a sort of fringe idea, but it I don't know. It does strike me as something which is very fundamentalist and not necessarily healthy, but obviously that's from my atheist skeptic sort of perspective. So yeah, I didn't know what either of your thoughts were on that. I didn't know much to contribute, but I just thought it was an aspect we hadn't really touched on. So.
That was a perfect contribution. I mean, it actually gives me more questions than answers. Like my big question would be, this is my big like scientific, let's do a research project question, is there a link between the majority of those really hardcore preppers and that sort of fear that is taught through religious ideology? So not just end times teaching, but just fear teaching in general, where it's like fear the government, fear the social structure, fear, the safety of
minorities or people from other
right.
countries or
Yeah, or whatever the case may be. It seems like this is completely just me off the top of my head with no data whatsoever. It seems to me that there's a lot of ties between sort of that fear of the lack of permanence that's taught by religions and these like really hardcore preppers. And I don't know for sure that there's any correlation. But that would be my question to ask is, what do you guys think there is a correlation between how people are taught to think in religion and the sort of what would you call that, really like over the top, like over prepping?
I would certainly hypothesize that was the case. It is an assumption I would start with that would be tested. I'd be looking to test.
Right. It wouldn't be a
like,
conclusion. It's more a question, like a thesis. Yeah.
But I think I was really looking lots of ways in terms of the Christianity that I was raised in. Sort of didn't include any of that. Like I never was raised with a fear of hell. I was never raised with the fear of Satan or of sins being like this big thing. It was a much more calm, reasonable, sensible, sort of very subdued British sort of idea of Christian, ideas of Christian.
Take the happy, leave out the scary.
And so obviously after having left that Christianity, I've not suddenly had to then grapple with all these ideas of hatred and fear of various things, because actually that wasn't even part of it to begin with. And I think for me that makes it difficult to identify in a lot of ways with some of the people who have these ideas. If you're raised in such a sort of heightened sense of fear all the time about the end of the world because those authority figures in your life are telling you that's what's going to happen, like of course that will affect the way that you go about your life and the things that you value and prioritize. But yeah, obviously from our point of view, it's just the basis upon which those fears are built is like not there. It's just non-existent. Which then
I know from
sorry, go on, John.
From friends I've got who are of that, who were of that ilk when they were religious. I think they'd be, and I'm not naming names, but I think they'd be the first ones to say that when they were ultra religious and had those kind of fear-based systems, they were also very kind of into right-wing politics and had fear of kind of immigration, of the other, and of gay people, of whatever. I think
terrifying of gay people, terrifying.
Yeah, scary.
Lots
of sarcasm there for those of you listening. Lots of sarcasm, just to get it out there.
We don't mean that.
Clarify that point.
You've just thrown me off completely. Because I was just trying to imagine what a terrifyingly gay person would look like. But go on, because I've lost my train of thought now.
Going to what you were saying, and I mean I might be totally off base of what you're saying, but I think I agree with your point. Is that it's not necessarily the religious ideologies that are teaching that you need to prep. It's sort of the ideologies that are attached to it or come along with it. And I don't know if it's more culturally or societally driven, where it's like
mindsets that it engenders.
Yeah. Like the majority of Christians in America are also conservative Republicans. And then what does that mean? Like where you start to now adopt beliefs that are extra religious, right? They have nothing to do with your religion, nothing to do with the Bible, but now they've been kind of associated with it. And
you could rationally put those two things side by side and talk about how utterly contradictory they are, in lots of ways. But obviously some of these ideas and fears and worries that people have are not necessarily rational, in where they're from. But then lots of preppers, I imagine, would say, no, this is the only rational way of thinking about things. If you're not doing all this preparation, if you're not getting ready to make sure your family and people you love survive in the worst case scenario, how on earth is that rational?
Yeah, and that's where like even though we might be talking about predominantly religious people, where religion kind of leaves it, because I was thinking about this while you guys were talking. Like if you think about the Christian apocalypse, there would be zero need to do any prep other than live it up and enjoy your life while you're here, because you're going to be just taken up into heaven. What is it called? I can't remember the word for it. Raptured. You're going to be raptured anyway. And so the people who really need to prep and be ready are all the non-believers, right? Because we're the ones that are going to be left behind fighting for survival. So I was thinking about it, and it's like it doesn't really make sense as a religious practice to do like a lot of doomsday specific prep. But there is, like what Gilliver was saying, there's that tie between that sort of fear thinking and the arguments of a collapse of a government or collapse of an economic system, to the point where it becomes a little bit obsessive. So it's almost like the ideology of prepping gets linked in with their religious ideology, and it takes on the same strength and the same vigor and the same sort of certainty, right? And like this is all conjecture. This is all just me based on what I
should put that as the subtitle of the show. Yeah. This is all conjecture.
This is all conjecture. This is me sort of, and like what Gilliver was saying, this is something that would be really interesting to see if there's studies out there to see where the links are. Because I was watching this show a while back, like years ago. It was called like Doomsday Preppers or something like that. And not many people ever mentioned, oh, I'm prepping for the rapture, regardless of how religious or not religious they were. But what they did talk a lot about was like what Gilliver was saying, the collapse of the government, or immigration's gonna ruin us and our economy is gonna collapse, and all these people are gonna come in and they want social services and blah blah blah, and it's gonna just destroy us, right? So then the question would be, if the apocalypse isn't the main reason why these people are prepping, is there still a link between the religious teachings, or I should say dogmatic or ideological teachings?
See, I think it's interesting as well that if you kind of compare that to dogmatic Islamism,
Islamic belief,
yeah, something like that. In Islam they have this saying, which is, you probably heard it, Laura. Richard may have or may not have heard it, which is Inshallah, which literally means God willing.
God willing, yeah.
So the much more, even the kind of more fundamental ones are much more kind of, we'll put it in the hands of God, rather than, let's go crazy and prep for this kind of ultra right-wing imagined disaster, which is
I remember when I was a Christian, though, that reminded me of a joke, and I'll try and tell the short version of, like, there was a man who was in a boat that was sinking, and he prayed to God and asked for help, and they a lifeboat comes along and says, come and get in the lifeboat. He's like, no thanks, I'm waiting for God to help me, and all of that, and eventually God's like, I did help you. He ended up drowning, went to heaven, and God's like, I did help you send the lifeboat, I sent this and sent this, and it reminded me of that. But so then it's that thing of, well, if we're relying on God to help me, well, actually God's given me the abilities to get food for my family, and prepping that way, because that's how God's helping me, providing all these things in advance. And you could look at it in that way, or just completely not prep at all, because it is going to be in God's hands. And I guess those are two conflicting ways of seeing it from that religious viewpoint.
And I would say both those positions probably exist in abundance, right? There's probably plenty of people who are like, oh, you crazy people, you don't need to prep because, man, we got this, God's got us, or when the apocalypse does happen, we're being raptured anyway, or whatever, that sort of security that, like, hey, I've got this safety blanket, I'm good to go, I don't need this additional stuff. But then you're right, there's also the side of, like, no, this is, God gives me the ability to build this bunker and stockpile this food, and the God-given right to own these guns, and that kind of stuff. So which is
most importantly.
Yeah. I want to know where in the Bible it says thou shalt own as many guns as possible, but whatever.
Thou shalt stockpile firearms.
Now
that's what Jesus would have done.
Okay, so we're kind of getting off topic of the whole hoarding thing. We're not hoarding, but what is it? The prepping thing. But yeah, I think that there could be some interesting links, just like what you guys were saying, and like the mindset, right? But then at the same time, the question is that really important? Like, is it important that someone's stockpiling because they have this religious or political ideology? Or so in other words, is it a good or bad practice regardless of the excuses given for the practice, right? So do you guys think it's good to prep and to what degree, regardless of if you're doing it for religious or political or just sensible reasons?
I think during this conversation, I don't think prepping has really entered my mind as the thing that I should consider or think about really for me and my family before this conversation. Really, I've kind of known about it and it's kind of come and gone in my mind without making much of an impact. But I think there are certain things that I could do quite easily and cheaply in a really manageable way, which would, set me and my family in good stead in case of some sort of emergency where we don't have access to food or whatever else. Having that basic supply, like you said, I think I've got about 2 or 3 months of food in the house. I definitely don't have 2 or 3 months of food in the house because we get what food we need and we run out and get some more food because I know there's that supply there. Having dried and tinned food in the house that we know is there just in case. And it's a few of those things, isn't it? Like more just in case things that would be easy to do, would be reasonable, wouldn't like disadvantage other people by taking supplies of things that, are needed for everybody.
Right. Because they're not overdoing it.
What was your question?
Oh, just like the validity of prepping in general, regardless of, and to what extent it's valid. Like there's always the not enough and there's always the too much, right? But in between, there's got to be some sort of reasonable amount of, what, that kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So what do you guys think that is?
I don't know, because I think it's, as we've mentioned throughout the show, there's many different kinds of prepping, and it's kind of hard to answer. I'm on the Richard front with the amount of food and stuff we've got in the house.
Although Gilliver does have an abundance of flammable fuel behind him.
He will be warm for many months.
But
and well educated.
I do have water filters, and I do have water filter bottles that I can take out and fill up and drink clean water. I do have knives of various sorts, which had helped me kind of build things if I needed to, or chop things up if I needed to. I've got an abundance of very low temperature sleeping bags and things like that. So I've got rather than just your bog standard summer holiday kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I have.
Okay, so what is an abundance of sleeping bags?
Well, enough.
Like more than enough.
A full cornucopia of sleeping bags.
Like what? 50, 12?
Well, there are 4 in the house, and
right.
We've got a couple each, so we've got enough to snuggle up together and keep warm if it's. And these are ultra winter temperature sleeping bags. They're not your bog standard kind of summer holiday.
Right.
It's going to reach
sleep on the back deck because it's warm.
8.
Yeah.
So I'm not a prepper as such, but I've got enough stuff in the house to give me a reasonable. I don't want to say advantage because that sounds like I'm going to shoot my neighbor, but certainly enough to kind of keep my own family kind of safe for a little while the worst of whatever comes up, without going overboard and having cupboards full of food and things like that.
Right, having a whole extra cellar or something like that.
Yeah. I've not gone out and bought this is stuff that's accumulated over years through my own in no way thinking about prepping, but just because I like going into the mountains and kind of sleeping up there when it's cold. So I've needed this stuff anyway. So yeah, it's and the skill sets are there. So I don't think. Well, some skill sets are there to
You've got your pro
Laura. No, I wasn't thinking about fighting, but the basic fire building and things like that. So, but I've not prepped in any way whatsoever. I've not got special I've not got an escape route planned.
Not in that sort of stereotypical hoarding tons and tons and tons of food. Yeah. So we're coming up towards the end of the show, and I did have one final thoughts question to run by you guys that Gilliver actually just made me think of. But Gil, did you want to add any more to that in terms of answering that question?
No.
Okay, fantastic. So the last question I have just popped in my head. we talk about prepping, and we've mentioned a few times during the show that it can mean different things to different people, and it's very scenario based. So, given the fact that we can't, like, no human being can possibly prep entirely perfectly for every single possible scenario, what do you guys think are some ways? And I'll start by answering the question so you kind of know where my mind is at with this. But what are some ways in which you guys prep for different sort of potential eventualities, whether or not they actually occur? So, like me, for example, when we go hiking, I always take a first aid kit. I always take extra water. And we have general precautions like whistles if we get separated sometimes, especially when the kids were little, they each had a whistle around their neck. And then just general knowledge of what do you do if you run into a bear, which happens a lot in the mountains that I live next to. It's cool. Yeah. But so we have these sort of things that we do to prep for outings, right? When I go in the car, we always have a case of water in the car. We have extra blankets in the car and extra sweatshirts in the car. Because with children, you always have the oh, I'm really cold, I forgot my sweatshirt. But then you also have breaking down or getting stuck somewhere longer than expected.
Or inconveniently vomiting down oneself.
Yeah, especially when they were little, right? Yeah, so those things have been things that I have actually had to use, and the fact that I had them was very, very advantageous. So that they're very reasonable things to prepare and have handy. So what do you guys think in terms of your guys' own practices?
I'm prepared for bears through the fact that they've been extinct for a couple of thousand years in the UK. So I'm prepped on the bears front. But I think everything you described, though, is like easy and reasonable things to prepare for reasonably expectable circumstances. And like nothing that you've described is arduous, expensive, consuming much space. It's like we go camping in the summer, and obviously we don't go like wild camping. We'll go to like managed facility,
obviously,
sites with like toilets and electricity and things.
We go camping where there's still bats.
Yeah. But like, I always make sure that we take, an extra rope if a rope on the tent snaps. We take, candles in case the electricity doesn't work. We take extra blankets for if it's cold than we think it's going to be. And it is just those things that, you've got and you can use, and that, seem reasonable for reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, and things that the vast majority of the time you don't need. But then when you do need it, you're like, yes, I've got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting about the kind of everyday scenario as well. I mean, as far as camping goes, I briefly touched on it a moment ago, so I'm not going to delve too much into that. But I do go wild camping, and I have needed a first aid kit because I have stuck a hunting knife in my hand. So it's being prepared is useful in those circumstances.
I'm really squeamish, and I would just die. I would just die.
You say you have all these different knives for cutting things, and my first thought is maybe you shouldn't.
How much can you prep to save yourself from yourself, children?
It's a story for another time. But the interesting one that Laura touched on for me was kind of traveling anywhere in the car, because I don't really take anything extra if I go out in the car anyway. But we live in a place which is kind of, I imagine, much different to where you live, and anywhere I'm going to break down, there's going to be somewhere I can walk to within 20 minutes or a half an hour.
That reminded me, my dad in the sort of late 90s, he used to drive over to Rochdale to work, which is about sort of like 45 minutes an hour away from where we are, and he had to go over the moors.
The moors.
There's one morning in Sorry?
I was just teasing you, the moors.
Moors, yeah.
Moors. To me, that's like cows. They're moors.
What? The moorland.
The moors.
It's like heather and lush shrubs. So, but he was going over the roads, and there was some black ice on the roads, and he was driving in his car, and he went down this like 100-foot ditch. Like he, at the time, thanked God that he didn't die or wasn't badly injured. But he was like stuck down there, and he'd only just got a mobile phone a couple of weeks before, but he didn't have any signal. He had to climb up part of the thing. But from then, he's always had like a supply of stuff in the boot for if anything happens where he's isolated or whatever, he's got some food, he's got something to keep warm, he's got whatever. But like he wouldn't have gone to those extents, and he wouldn't have that in his boot now had that event not happened to him. So like that's something in real life where he wasn't prepared for that eventuality. And then when he managed to survive it against the odds, then thought, I can do something about it in future if it were to happen. And so, yeah, sometimes it is linked to things in the future, but I guess sometimes it's based on experience in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
And I think this whole thing touches on that prepping doesn't have to be this kind of crazy, over the top, like arm yourself with 500 thermonuclear devices in case your neighbor attacks your food supply.
You never know.
Prepping can just be as simple as chucking a couple of blankets into your car in case, you break down in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, or buying like a couple extra cases of canned food at Costco. Like my dad used to do that when I was growing up, and we'd cycle through it, right? He put the newer cases in the back and the older cases up front. We would just eat from it throughout the year. And I remember as a young adult, all the kids had moved out and he was on his own, but he was still doing this practice. So he comes to me one day with cases of clam chowder and chicken noodle soup. And he's like, here, these are going to expire in the next like 6 months and I can't eat them all. So here's free. And like, so me as a starving, not starving, I had a good job, but 19-year-old on their own in her own little studio apartment. Like I was like, yes, free food. But it was because of that sort of prepping habit he had of just having a few extra cans of food available.
And of course, my wife was a Mormon, and they're encouraged to prep. Mm-hmm. So we did have a stage where we had lots of extra food in the cupboards, and then she wasn't a Mormon, so we ate it all.
Interesting correlation. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the show. Did you guys have any other little closing thoughts or comments before I close this puppy up?
I just think it's interesting.
Go on, Richard. What?
Oh no, I was literally just saying no, crack on, but
I just think it's interesting. It's from going. It's like this reminds me of kind of the reflective tasks you have to do at university when you look back over your learning. And I came out at the start of the show with the idea of prepping being these kind of big kind of homestead, multi-gunned, canned tin food expecting the end of the world kind of people. And it, just talking has just made me realize it can just be something so simple. It doesn't have to be that kind of crazy idealism. It can be just be practical everyday. Practical thing.
I love how like sort of skeptical or just conversational talk about a topic can make you challenge your own sort of precepts or impressions or beliefs. I think we all kind of came into it with the whole, we're going to talk about the doomsday preppers. But there is so much more to it. And I'm glad that we delved into more than just that. It would have been a very boring show if we had just focused on that the whole time.
It's not like us to go down rabbit holes at all.
Oh, never. No, we're straight arrows. Stick to the course. Okay, so that's it. Before we start just talking ourselves out of an audience, I think it's time to call it. I think it's time to call it today. But thank you everybody for listening. I'm gonna try and put little shorts on at the end of every show, so listen all the way through to the end and see what kind of stuff from behind the scenes that I can come up with and cut and paste into there.
Like the post-credit scene at a Marvel movie. That's the equivalent.
Yes, it is worth waiting for. Or, technology worth fast forwarding for. Yeah. But thank you all for joining us. I can't wait to hear your guys' thoughts on the Facebook page. It seems like every week, whatever we post stimulates a lot of really awesome discussion. So thank you guys for continuing to keep all those discussions rolling. We will catch you guys next week. In the meantime, I am Laura.
Richard.
And Richard. And this has been Skeptic Hangout. And until next time.
Keep questioning.
Interrogate your beliefs.
And stay skeptical.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Ta-ra.
Stay skeptical. All right. 5-ish minute break before the next one.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Cool.
Go make a brew.
Bye all.
Bye.